Paul McCartney spent decades hiding his true feelings about one woman. She walked into Beatles recording sessions in 1968 and destroyed.
At 83 years old, standing in the twilight of one of the most extraordinary careers in music history, Paul McCartney has finally decided to let the world see behind the curtain. For more than half a century, the world has adored him as the warm, charming, eternally optimistic face of the Beatles, the man who gifted humanity the soundtrack to its greatest moments. But behind that famous smile lies a story of silence, endurance, and wounds that very few people ever truly understood. In a candid and deeply personal confession recently shared with the press, this music legend stopped sidestepping the darker chapters of his past and chose instead to face them head-on. He revealed that his journey was not simply paved with gold records and standing ovations, but was also scarred by profound personal betrayals and heartbreaks inflicted by the very women he held closest to his heart. These were not fleeting disappointments. They were deep fractures that altered the course of music history and shattered his world in ways the public never fully saw. For those of us who have lived long enough to know that time does not always bring peace, Paul's vulnerability feels achingly human. So, who were these women? Who broke the heart of the man who wrote the world's greatest love songs? And why do these names still carry such weight even decades later? It is time to look beyond the legend and hear the story of the scars that never fully faded. If there is one name that sits at the very center of Paul McCartney's deepest and most enduring heartbreak, it is undoubtedly Yoko Ono. She was not simply a romantic partner who complicated things. To Paul, she was the force that dismantled his most sacred creative sanctuary and took from him the person he loved most in the world, his best friend. To understand the true depth of this wound, we have to travel back to London in the spring of 1966, to a small avant-garde gallery in the heart of the city. It was there that John Lennon, the restless, rebellious soul of the band, first encountered a petite Japanese performance artist whose world was built on concepts and provocation. Paul, with his characteristic optimism, barely registered the meeting. He saw only a slightly eccentric acquaintance of John's. He had no way of knowing that this encounter was the first breath of a storm that would eventually bring down the greatest band in history. And the real heartbreak began 2 years later, inside the walls of Abbey Road Studios. For years, the Beatles had lived by an unspoken but ironclad rule. No partners, no outsiders, no distractions during recording sessions. The studio was their fortress, the one place where everything outside ceased to exist and only the music mattered. But that boundary was crossed, and John allowed it. She did not sit quietly in the background. She pulled her chair right beside him, whispered opinions on tempo and melody, and stared with an intensity that made the air in the room difficult to breathe. An EMI technician later recalled that every time she spoke, Paul would clench his jaw and the entire room would fall into a suffocating silence. For a man of Paul's creative intensity, this was not just an inconvenience. It was psychological torment. How he felt controlled, pushed aside, and unable to be himself in the one place he had always felt most free. George Harrison eventually walked out. Ringo Starr later admitted he felt invisible. But for Paul, the pain was far more personal. He was watching the person he had grown up with, the boy from Liverpool who had become his musical other half, drifting away before his eyes, drawn into a world he could not reach or understand. The tension that had been quietly building finally snapped when John delivered the words that would echo for decades. During a band meeting in 1969, Paul made one last desperate attempt to bring the group back to its roots, pleading for a return to what they had built together. John's reply was cold, final, and devastating. He said he had everything he needed now, and the Beatles were no longer part of that picture. Biographers have described it as the moment the greatest friendship in rock history ended. What followed was a messy, very public unraveling, filled with lawsuits and legal battles that played out in the press for years. The bitterness spilled into their music. Paul released pointed lyrics that many read as veiled commentary on the situation. John responded with a song so sharp and personal in its attack on Paul's character and talent that fans still wince when they hear it. And yet, even after John's tragic passing in 1980, peace did not come easily. The grief was complicated by everything that had gone unresolved between them. At a public memorial years later, onlookers noticed that Paul never once looked in Yoko's direction, even as they stood on the same stage. Or in a rare moment of honesty on a podcast released in 2023, Paul finally exhaled the weight of decades and admitted that he had lost his closest friend, and that everything had shifted from the moment she entered their world. It was not anger in his voice, it was grief, pure and unresolved. To the world, Yoko Ono was and remains a significant artist, but to Paul McCartney, she will always represent the loss of something irreplaceable, a friendship that shaped everything he ever became. If that chapter represents the agonizing loss of a brotherhood, the next woman in Paul's life represented a catastrophic error in judgment that cost him something equally precious, his dignity. While the first wound cut at his heart, this next one went straight for his reputation, or transforming a grieving legend into the subject of global ridicule. To understand how a man of Paul's intelligence could fall into such a trap, you have to understand where he was emotionally in the summer of 1999. He was not the confident, unshakable Beatle the world knew. He was a man completely adrift, still reeling from the loss of Linda, his wife and anchor for nearly 30 years. Grief makes people vulnerable in ways they cannot anticipate, and it was in that fragile, unguarded state, at a hotel event in London, that he met Heather Mills. She appeared to be everything a broken heart needed. A former model who had survived a serious accident and lost part of her leg, she had reinvented herself as a tireless humanitarian. To a grieving Paul, she radiated resilience and warmth. She made him believe that joy was still possible, that the future could be beautiful again. Despite quiet warnings from those closest to him, most notably his daughter Stella, who reportedly saw through the performance from the very beginning, Paul followed his heart. In the summer of 2002, surrounded by fireworks and celebration, he made her his wife. But the fairy tale began to unravel almost immediately. Once the vows were exchanged, the portrait of the charitable survivor began to reveal a very different picture beneath it. Reports surfaced that she was attempting to manage every aspect of his life, isolating him from loyal staff and long-standing friends, positioning herself as the gatekeeper to his entire world. But the man who had once navigated the chaos of being a Beatle found himself living in a pressure cooker of a different kind entirely. When she filed for divorce in 2006, the financial demand she placed on the table sent shockwaves around the world. The figure she sought was so staggering that it instantly transformed their private heartbreak into a global spectacle the press quickly dubbed the most expensive romantic mistake in music history. The courtroom proceedings that followed were extraordinary for all the wrong reasons. She chose to represent herself, and what unfolded was less a legal proceeding and more theatrical performance, complete with tearful speeches casting Paul as a villain in his own story. The judge's final ruling was devastating for her. He awarded a fraction of what she had demanded, and in a remarkably candid written judgment described her account of events as unreliable and embellished. Her credibility was in ruins. But in a moment that became instant international news, she responded by pouring a jug of water over Paul's legal representative right there in the courtroom. Paul emerged from the building and offered the press just 5 words. He said he was glad it was over. He had protected his fortune, but the toll on his spirit was something money could never measure. He had been exposed, in the most public way imaginable, as a man who had let loneliness lead him somewhere he should never have gone. Heather Mills delivered a brutal lesson about the difference between what people appear to be and who they actually are. Yet, long before that very public disaster, the woman Paul loved most deeply had unintentionally caused his artistic reputation to take fire. Unlike the calculated ambition of the woman who came after, this one acted entirely out of love, and the world punished both of them for it. When Paul first met Linda Eastman in 1967 at a club in London, she was not a starstruck admirer chasing celebrity. She was a confident, independent American photographer who seemed barely impressed by his fame. That authenticity was precisely what captured him. When the Beatles collapsed and Paul sank into a depression so deep that he struggled to leave his farm in Scotland, it was Linda who stayed beside him, coaxed him back to life, and gave him a reason to pick up a guitar again. She was not just a companion, she was his recovery. But Paul's profound need to keep her close led to one of the most controversial decisions of his post-Beatles career. Terrified that the distance of touring would eventually destroy what they had, he invited her into his new band. He handed her a keyboard with virtually no musical background and placed her on some of the biggest stages in the world. The reaction was merciless. Music publications ran withering headlines. Critics dismissed the band as a vanity project. Audiences jeered. The narrative took hold quickly and cruelly that the great Paul McCartney was being dragged down by an amateur who had no business being on that stage. The lowest point came during a European tour in the early 70s. At one particular concert, the crowd turned hostile, directing their frustration not at Paul, but at Linda, chanting and booing while she stood frozen under the stage lights. After the show, Paul, who was almost never known to lose his composure, exploded in fury, making it unmistakably clear that no one would speak about her that way. He chose love over reputation without hesitation, every single time. The tragedy is that he only fully understood the cost of that choice after it was too late to apologize for the moments he had doubted himself. After Linda's heartbreaking passing from illness in 1998, the critical narrative faded into mourning. But Paul's own conscience held on to something harder to release. In a documentary released a few years later, he watched old footage of those early concerts, saw the fear on her face, and heard the cruelty of the crowd and broke down completely. He admitted that he had sometimes blamed her for the damage to his reputation, and that the only person he truly should have blamed was himself, for not making his priorities clearer sooner. Linda had not damaged his legacy. She had simply loved him and paid a heavy price for it in the court of public opinion. But before the farm in Scotland, before Wings and the chaos of touring with someone who was learning as she went, there was a woman who represented something else entirely. She was the woman who first showed Paul that even the most perfect romantic picture can be shattered in a single moment of weakness. Jane Asher was not simply a girlfriend. She was, to the England of the swinging 60s, a symbol of cultural perfection. a red-haired actress with an aristocratic elegance and a sharp intellect.